The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society is pleased to present this recording from February 24th, 2021, for writers and readers alike. Promotions Chair Lisa Yarde is in conversation with authors Nicole Glover and Piper Huguley about family, love, and history in multicultural fiction. They discuss their characters and historical settings, the joys of writing multi-generational fiction, and the obstacles of getting multicultural fiction published and marketed. Information about our chapter and its leadership is available at our website, link listed in the description. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
Good evening, everyone. We are so pleased that you can join us for an evening with Nicole Glover and Piper Huguley. I am Lisa Yarde, one of the social media managers of the HNS NYC chapter. And as Faith mentioned, I will be your host this evening. Let's kick things off by having each of the authors introduce themselves. Piper won the coin toss, so she will go first.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Piper Huguley, and I've been writing historical romance and historical fiction since 2014. My focus is on the Black experience in the United States from those what are called spaceship years after the Civil War to the Civil Rights period, called spaceship, because seemingly in history, a big spaceship came and took all the Black people away during those 100 years. There's not much usually talked about during that particular period. So that's what my focus is in terms of the work I do in both historical romance and in historical fiction.
Excellent. Thank you. Sounds very interesting. And Nicole, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Nicole Glover. I'm primarily a fantasy writer. My debut is historical fantasy. And yeah, and like Piper, I also, when I come to history, I'm also like interested in the spaceship years as well. All this, the time period of is very fascinating to me, is from a research point and a personal standpoint. So I think a lot of my stories end up either directly involved that, or either directly about it, or involve like themes from that time period.
Excellent, excellent. Your novels, both of your novels sound wonderful. Can you tell us about your novel and what inspired you to write it? Whichever one of you would like to go first, please do.
I guess I won. So I have two historical romance series. One is called the Hampton Milford College series, which focuses on a fictitious, historically Black college and university. I felt that there was not enough or any that I'd seen focus on that experience, on that particular Black experience in a fictitious way. Having taught at two HBCUs over the years, I really wanted to bring forward and highlight that history. And so my Home to Milford College series does that. I'm also the author of the Migrations of the Heart series, which is loosely based on the experiences of my grandmother and great aunt for the Great Migration, the largest internal migration in the United States. Or, as it's more popularly understood, how Black people in the United States went from rural to urban situations in the United States. So, I told my grandmother and great aunts I was going to write about them one day, and so I did with that particular series. And this next year, I'll be making my debut in biographical historical fiction next winter with William Morrow. So I'll look forward to it.
Excellent. Looking forward to that one. Nicole.
Okay. My novel Conductors was born. I'm interested in the Reconstruction time period. Is that since it's from growing up from history, it's it's like a page, maybe a bit like a page, maybe 2 pages in like history books, and I was fascinated by all the stuff that in that time period. So I wanted to really explore that. And I did with a fantasy element, because I think, mostly a fantasy writer, I always find that you can do interesting things with fantasy to kind of work with themes or just explore different avenues with the history. So that was kind of fun. The idea for the story itself was like, me mixing up different story ideas I had at the time, because I had an idea for characters and I had some themes I wanted to work with, but I just kind of melted together. It's kind of fell into place. And I think the mystery element was one of those things that kind of just slid right in there without me really planning it.
As often happens for many a writer, I'm sure there are things that pop in that we don't quite expect. Piper, can you tell us a bit more of the details about the Virtuous Ruby and where the premise for that came from?
Yeah, Virtuous Ruby, the premise came from several things put together. That's the first novel in the Migrations of the Heart series about the Great Migration. One of my lingering questions that had always been, what made it get started? How did it start? And it was this perfect confluence of several things coming together. Were the World War, or as it was known then, the Great War in Europe, and the cessation of the immigrants coming over to work in the northern manufacturing. Several years of poor crops in the South. And also, I like to point to a different generation being born in the South that had not experienced enslavement and therefore was not used to the ways in which people were looked upon to behave as enslaved people. So with all of these things coming together, you get a generation of people who are more determined, or who were seemingly more determined to seek out liberation, to make that reach for better education, a better way for their children, and had the willingness to leave home altogether. Like I said, my grandmother, who was the first one of her sisters to make that trip, did it, and came from Western Alabama, where there is a town named Huguley. It's a little podunk place. Nothing is happening there. But I was inspired by the fact that this place, and what I've come to learn lately, that it's named Huguley because that was the name of the plantation owner there. It's not always the case that works out, but that is the case. The name of the plantation owner there, George Huguley, who had owned my grandfather's family, etc., had later parlayed their stuff into a series of linen mills. People probably know West Point towels, stuff like that, washcloths, etc. That's where that is. And that they had worked in those mills. So I was curious about the impact of what it would be if you had a series of sisters who were looking to either work in those mills or not work in those mills, and how they might leave. And so that's what Ruby does. When a doctor comes into the town, and they clash, of course, because she's the midwife in the town, and he's just been recently graduated in all the new and wonderful ways, which are not so wonderful as we know if we think about what medicine like in 1915. Like, forget about it. It's like, what is he doing to that baby? That they clash about their ways in which to treat the community, and of course, over time they fall in love. It's a much, and I say historical romance, people are thinking like Fabio and people with their shirts ripped off and stuff like that. But the way I write it is much grittier in terms of and it was like, it really took a lot of people by surprise, because I do adhere much more closely to a more real life type of situation. So there's the HEA, but they have some bumps along the road along the way. So.
As every good romance, in every good romance, they've got to work for that HEA. So that is wonderful. Nicole, I found it so fascinating in reading about your novel. I am a huge fan of fantasy novels, but this was the first time where I really began to explore. Wow, this is quite fascinating to read about historical fantasy. Can you tell us a bit more about the journey of your characters and the conductors?
Where to start? I kind of, one of the things I wanted with the characters was that I wanted to have like a back history of them, have their back history being the conducting part, because I was more interested in what they do afterwards. Like I really like the idea that, you know, they're done with, you know, they're done with the Civil War, done with they're trying to settle down into new lives, kind of paralleling the lives of many people had to kind of rebuild like after Civil War. And for me, for the story was, you know, like what did the people do? Because the big kind of question is like, after they went through Civil War, they are emancipated, they're slowly getting these rights. And that was a kind of big question I have. And in general, I'm where I started going deep into research. But for the characters themselves in the story, I also started thinking, what would they do in their lives? And I think the mystery solving aspect of it is on level the genre aspect of, you know, of just solving mysteries, but I think it became tied with community. One of the things I kind of started from the beginning was that they're trying to look out for the community, looking out for their friends, looking out for their neighbors, even the people they don't particularly like, because they're friendly people, but they still can kind of be prickly a bit. You know, they're more like, you know, likely to really give the honest truth about certain things, but they want to look out for the community, want to look out for the place they called home. There's a reason they keep coming back to Philadelphia, why Philadelphia is their home base, even though technically they can go anywhere they want to. And they have a lot of good friends. I think it was the friends and like in the found family sense was one of the kind of themes that became really important, became really strong in the book, even though I didn't set out to write it. And I think because I was interested in all this, the very strong community ties that I found in the research, finding out about mutual aid societies, that they had the beneficial societies they had, that there was these organizations that helped arrange that, so people, if they needed funerals, that they would have, there's a system in play, and this all these little things that makes sense knowing what I know about, you know, but you know, from my family and friends, all the communities around I've been in, see all the community experiences I have from our different relatives. So I shouldn't be too surprised they had all this stuff years ago, and even before Civil War, back in antebellum, they had all these really strongly knit communities, especially of all this things going on. So I think I think that all the elements of the mystery solving was the elements for me to kind of explore that and kind of to see a different side of it. Because I think one of the things I tried to explore in the book was like more of the interior private lives. It's in a sense that it's the stories focus more on like on their lives and things around them and in their community. And that was, I guess that's kind of their big journey in that. I guess the journey mostly for the characters kind of go is finding what's exactly their place, kind of redefining things, because the name death in the book kind of helps them recalibrate their lives beforehand, because in the sense that they're in a kind of pause before the events of the books, and there's a catalyst for new things throughout the book that happens throughout the book.
Excellent, excellent. I think one of the most fascinating things for writers and readers of historical fiction is the sense of the journey, not only the sense that the characters themselves are on a journey, but the readers are also, in essence, on a journey of discovery as well. When you were writing the novel, The Conductors, what was the most interesting or weird thing that you found out in doing your research?
I'm not sure it's weird. I know I did when I was doing some like Civil War. It was mostly Underground Railroad stuff. It was like I was uncovering the myths. Like you always heard about the quilts, about the quilts having messages, and that's like for most I couldn't find a variable source saying that's actually real or not. It seemed like it was people just kind of made it up, and it sounded quaint and interesting. I guess because codes, people like secret codes and whatnot, but it's not a real thing. And some of the songs, I think there might be one or two, maybe possibly there's strong things that might have been code words, but most of the time it's just people just going with the myth and just making. I guess there was a lot of mythifying a lot of stuff in the Underground Railroad. Like they made I guess even though it's very real, there are people just doing like, helping out people. Because I found a lot of stories, it's just people, they might have a boat, they might help people get across the river one night, or they happen to hide someone in one of the ruins. But in general, there's ordinary stuff, and it's like there's a lot of mythifying around certain elements of history, because mostly because we don't know certain things, and we have to fill in the gaps of imagination. And I know I did a lot of research with folk tales. I think I got really interested in all the flying stories, flying myths and fables and stuff like that. A lot of that was drawn from like the idea of people escaping and going to freedom. And I was fascinated how many there were. Because I think I dug around and found a bunch of books that covered a lot of these different stories, and a lot of ghost stories too, a lot of talking skull stories and all of that. I think that's fascinating to me, since I'm a mystery, so I spent a lot of time looking at like stories around death and like things like ghosts and things of that nature. So a lot of just interesting things that kind of cropped up as I did research.
I'm sure Big Brother thinks that your Google searching is very interesting.
It's serious. All this murder stuff, death stuff. Every time I talk about a dead body, I look at this phrasing like how long does the people's body grow stiff, or like what breathes, all this fun stuff.
Very good. Piper, what about you? What were some of the sort of interesting, weird, I totally didn't expect that, things that you found out about the Great Migration?
One of the factoids that I still have that I'm going to deal with one of the sisters at some point is the whole aspect of, I guess, to continue on with Nicole's death theme, is how morticians played a role with people who were, when bodies were shipped or shipping people, on the train, if they were someone who was seen as a troublemaker in the community or whatever, and coffins and stuff like that. And the role that funeral homes played in allowing those spaces to be used for meetings and all of that other kind of stuff. And the fact that the morticians play, and even to this day continue to play, a certain role of leadership and support and activism in the community. So yeah, there was a lot of that there that I thought was very interesting to find out.
I think one of the things that I find as
Lisa,
is that you can you start off with your main character.
Lisa, we're losing you on the mic. Can you get closer?
No, we can't hear.
Yeah.
One moment, we'll figure this out. Hi, Lisa, we're having trouble hearing you.
Oof. It just went.
Yeah, we'll sort this out. No worries. Hang on.
Okay.
Hi, well, we're figuring this out. The question just came in. Nicole, what do you mean by fantasy versus just fiction?
Yeah, I guess fantasy versus fiction is more of, I guess from anything from like, the overts, the magical elements, to more of it kind of just breaking away from the fictional fact for certain things. I don't know. I guess it's I don't know. This is the best way that kind of explains certain things. I know that. I know at least with when I kind of came in with the idea of making this a fantasy story, more than just sticking with the historical fiction. It allowed me a little bit of freedom of playing around with the story, making it to allow me to play with certain themes I want to do that I couldn't necessarily do with historical fiction. Even though I could probably write the conductors without the magical elements. That just make it a straight, like, more of a historical mystery, I suppose to speak. But I think the fantasy element allowed me to have a little play element to the story. Allow me to, I guess, I don't know, just infuse some fun stuff in there to make things a little bit interesting. And yeah, it's not to say that just doing a straight historical fiction wouldn't be different, but I think it just allowed me to like kind of play with certain themes a bit more. And I think also it helped me to remove a bit from this thinking of it straightly this historical story, because I think with the speculative element, I found whether it's in fantasy or in science fiction in general, allows you to think, I guess allows certain themes and ideas to kind of build up and more to kind of to form more exploration. If that makes sense. No.
We have a great question here from Pearl. Pearl would like to know, would Piper repeat her explanation of the spaceship era after the Civil War?
Oh, yeah, it's just that because there's so little that people write about between Civil War and civil rights with Black people. One time Beverly Jenkins made this funny line about it must have been that a spaceship came and took up all the Black people for those 100 years and then brought them back in time, just in time, right, for Rosa Parks. So that's all Facebook.
Thank you.
Yeah. We just need to bring that era more forward.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think the only time period you might see is Harlem Renaissance. It's mostly just for the clubs and music.
Yeah, and then even that, the Harlem Renaissance is a misnomer. You know, you know, not to cast shade on any New York folk, but it's happening in other places too. That needs to be brought forward more. So yeah, you're right, Nicole, with that exception. Because I think you're right. People like the clubs.
Yeah, that's the only reason it's there. Like, no, they just want to go to stick down to the clubs. And it was just more, it's kind of very literal in the sense. I think I did some Harlem Renaissance related research, and it was just fascinating how these people have like went to the clubs as like kind of an excursion, so to speak. It's like a field trip to the clubs up in Harlem. You know, it's fascinating. But there's like lots of little stuff. I think I spent a period where I was exploring basically all, because once I got in the research buzz, I just started going all the way through history, and there's lots of little things that it never gets mentioned at all. That there's a lot of rich stuff. There's different decades, and if I had all the time in the world, I would write books about all of it.
Yeah, true. There's Lisa. Is she back?
I am back. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay, great. Live and happening, people. This is what happens sometimes, but let's hope that it won't happen again. Thank you so much for submitting those questions. I thought they were very fascinating answers, actually. Before I got disconnected, I was talking about the fact that as a writer, sometimes start off, you're reading your story with certain characters going in one direction, and then out of nowhere comes this character, this incident that you never expected, and it almost threatens to derail your story. Has either of you had an experience like that in writing your current novels?
Well, it's like one of the most lately that I've been working on in terms of the biographical historical one. It's a little less, a little less freedom with that. I think that in terms of fictionalizing certain events in Anlo's life, maybe, I felt compelled to sort of heighten certain elements more. But she had a very interesting life, so it wasn't that usual come out of the left field circumstance that does happen in other books, like where, at least for me, certain characters standing up and speaking in the church or something like that when, you know, they weren't supposed to do that. It's like, you sit down, please, or something like that. So yeah, in my most recent whip, not really, but it's happened before.
How about you, Nicole? Anything like that ever happened to you?
Kind of minor stuff. I know was when I was fleshing out the supporting cast for my book, I had this idea that I'm going to have like one of the people are going to be more science related and the other person is going to be more arts related, because I found research that I wanted to, you know, bring these elements to these characters, and somehow these elements kind of swaps characters. Like one became more artsy in the sense, the other one more sciencey, and like in the way I didn't expect it. Like it kind of naturally made sense as I was doing revisions, I was fleshing out these character motivations, things they did, and stuff like that. But that's like on a minor level, this is fleshing out characters. And I know the last thing I was working on, I was figuring out, I guess, how I should keep this person dead or alive, because, you know, it was one of the victims list basically, and I was trying to decide whether the book worked, whether they stayed dead or this person should be alive, and that's how some characters get the chopping block in this book, in my books and stuff, because as I'm fleshing out, you know, because I actually am kind of structured most of the time. I'm doing a mystery, and like I kind of figure out like some of the key elements, you know, who's the victims, like who did it, who the murderer is, who the reasons why, and everything like that. But sometimes I have, you know, there might be some extra victims and throw in the book, and sometimes I think it's some characters that started out and maybe they survived in the first draft, but as I went along, it's like maybe they should die and stuff. And I mean that's what happens with the murder stuff, I think. And I think, and also in general, I think with characters, I always tend to have excess characters in my first drafts, and I ended up combining character elements together as I revise and refine certain things. So some elements kind of merged together, and I think one character in my last book started off as one element of something, and entirely changed to something else by the end of by my last draft, which is a fascinating process to look back. But it made sense because I always had these ideas at the beginning.
Excellent, excellent. You're both each at very different stages of your writing career, but please tell us, what did that moment feel for you? What were you thinking? What was going through your head? The moment where you knew that this book that you'd been working so long on, for however long you were working on, what did that moment feel like when you knew finally it was going to make its debut, it was going to be published? And you can go first, Nicole, if you'd like.
I guess disbelief, you know, it came really quickly for me. It's like, I think I had got an agent and I went on sub, and about in a period of 6 months, I had already got the book sold. And like, which that doesn't happen, which I expect probably will never happen again. Like something like that. And it was all really quickly, even though I've been working on this book for a really long time, but holding the precious dream of publishing a book for like, you know, many years since I was a kid, basically. And so like, it's just all happening like really quickly. And so I was like a stunned disbelief. And it's like, it took me maybe like almost a year to actually kind of sink in, oh, this is actually happening. My book's going to be out somewhere. And yeah, it still seems like it's not real, even though it's being published next week or coming out officially next week.
Wonderful, wonderful feeling. What about you, Piper? You've won awards for your writing, but how does it feel when it's coming out? It's been published.
I've been, you know, everybody's like, oh, don't say that about yourself, but it's true. I have been agent poisoned for years. Nobody wanted me to write these books. Nobody was wanting me to publish them. You know, I self-published starting in 2014 with the Humpty Milford College series, but I started writing the Migrations of the Heart series. And I cannot tell you in terms of the kind of rejection and turnbacks, and one agent who was giving out cards to people when I was explaining what my book was about. And the cards in her hand, and then she put them back in her purse. And exactly right. That's why I say Agent Poison. I have reason to say that. It was like somebody on Twitter today was saying, I can't find an agent. But I was like, honey, if I can find an agent, you can find an agent. So nobody was looking for. But and most particularly as some of my friends are here, like Liz. Hey, Liz, who's here knows that Tessa Woodard from William Morrow put out on Twitter a call for the Ann Lowe story. She was looking for someone to write about who this Black designer was that designed Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress. And so my thought was like, and she's done that before with certain things. And I was like, well, I don't think that's anything that I want to do in terms of other topics that she has tweeted about. But that one, I was like, okay, I can get on board with that and hopefully make my way into traditional publishing with some of the other stories that I have on the back burner, have been researching for upwards of 10 years. I mean, I'm sure several of you know that in terms of historical fiction, that there are certain figures that won't let me go, and I'll keep trying. So I'm happy to have written this story that Tessa was looking for, and hopefully the others will come out in some form at some point. So I'm still waiting.
I think that is one of the most honest answers I have ever heard about the writing process in my life. That is very fascinating. That is very fascinating. When you're both looking at the current landscape for your books and thinking about what you will be writing in the future, how has the movement for social change, the dialogue about race, class, ethnicity that we're having all across America now, how is that shaping how you think about your writing future?
I mean, I don't think it's changed too much. These are always topics that are always kind of in my mind as I was writing to begin with. So I think it's I think I might take more interest in looking at certain terms that I didn't really know existed at the time, like a prison appellation, a reform, and all this other different things like that, or restorative justice, community-based justice, looking at those topics like that. But I mean, honestly, most of this stuff already kind of percolating in my mind to begin with. So it's like, it's just more as taking a closer look at it, taking more of this, looking more on my subconscious and stuff. But on the other side of things, I guess writing more things that are joyful, more like more fun stuff. Like, even though a book does have like fun elements to it, it's still tied to a not so fun part of history. And I did want to just kind of branch out. I guess things are more just happy stuff, more quieter story, that sort of thing, and just having a different variety of kind of stuff to work on in that sense.
Okay, makes sense. Definitely makes sense. How about you, Piper?
My whole goal, even like I said, since 2010, when I started taking up writing again, has been about giving people a voice that didn't have one. I think that's what these movements for social change have been about, is about bringing forward these voices and having them be heard, finally. I have a question that over the years that I've been teaching, that I would ask my students at HBCUs to tell me, how many biopics, feature film biopics, have there been about Black women in movies? And they'd have to sit there and think about that and toss stuff out. The Color Purple? No, that's fiction, right? And up until 2016, the answer was just 2. Anybody guesses? Lady Sings the Blues, right? Which, to that point, Lady Sings the Blues came out, in 72? And What's Love Got to Do with It, right? The 2 That's it. So there's always been this thing about the lives of real life Black women seemingly as not having value or story interest or anything like that. That to me is for me the movement in terms of giving voice and focus to these lives to showcase resiliency and strength and meaning and purpose. In all of those ways. So yeah, we have Hidden Figures and we have Harriet. We need more though. Like, it would be nice to get two hands of movies. Miss Jane Pittman was not real, to answer the question I just been coming up about. Ernest J. Gaines's fictitious novel that he wrote. Brilliant novel, and of course, loved the movie and everything. The recent departure of the brilliant Cicely Tyson, but no.
She's the one we need the movie about. I just finished reading her biography, and it's like
I know,
she.
wasn't it amazing? I did too. Yeah,
there's so much stuff. That'll be a great like movie.
That'd be a great biopic. Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, and that just would be one of the things that I would get students realizing. And then when they would realize that there isn't that many, they just be like astonished. It's time. It's time for these stories to be brought forward.
Absolutely. I am still waiting for the story of Ida B. Wells. I want to see it
on
screen.
Yeah.
I want to see it happen, but whether or not that will happen remains to be told.
Well, you know what? Her descendants are very, very involved there. And
good.
One of the things in terms of selecting a subject, I'm sure as many of you know, is that it'd be nice to have some people who don't have descendants. To be honest, I mean, you know.
Yes, because that's the reality. Very much reality.
And I would love to do it, hopefully, but I don't want to step on anybody's toes in terms of that. So I'm trying to cultivate a relationship with them. So one day.
Wonderful, wonderful. I see we've had lots of questions come in. Susan, would you mind helping get us started with some of those questions, please?
Yes, an interesting question from Pamela Johnson. Pamela wanted to know, Nicole and Piper, did either one of you work with a developmental editor? And if you did, how was that experience?
Well, because I've been self-published, but I did have my foray a couple of, in 2015 before Sam Hain departed, that I had not developmental edits, but copy edits. And that was very interesting on the Migrations of the Heart books. Most pointedly, and Most Precious Pearl, when the copy editor said about the father who was reading the newspaper and brought forward the fact that there had been a certain number of lynchings in Georgia the previous year. And the copy editor said, well, I only see that there were 8. And we really want people to like this family, so maybe don't bring that up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then on A Treasure of Gold, they made so many edits, so many that my agent, I mean, not my agent at that time, but my editor, when it was sent back to her, had a hard time opening the document. So. Not developmental necessarily per se, and I know for the Antelope book that's upcoming, I'll keep you posted.
Okay.
I do admit to feeling some trepidation about it, I'll tell you that. Yeah. So.
Nicole, what about you? Any developmental editing on your work?
I guess I was working with an editor through the publisher, so I think that kind of counts as developmental in a sense. But it's not. I wasn't fishing the phrase. But it was interesting to show. It was my first time actually being edited for anything. So it's more of like other notes of just figuring out how different pieces are working together and just kind of clarifying certain things. I think it was an odd experience because since I never really had that, you know, comments on like my work in such a manner like that. So it's like at first I was like, you know, I can't open this document right now. I think I took a few days before I actually read through all the notes and all this it's just journal big picture notes he'd had and stuff. So I was like, you know, it's like, you know, it's a weird thing. Like you feel like you made a failure. You have to go fix every little single thing. But I think a big thing I did, I was working with the editor, was realizing some things can stand. Like there's some things I feel strongly about that their vision doesn't really line up with mine. And there's some things I saw, yeah, they did really make certain changes for the better. I think actually like the last scene in the book, I actually had extended it out further to figure out the difference and it had the book end on a different way. But he had made a comment about making a cut earlier. And once it did that, it was like, it was a better ending that way. And just like, you know, working with that way for certain things and all other stuff. And I don't know, I think also the going through the other phases of like a different editing phase, like the copy edit phases, it was more like realizing, oh, there's still all these 100 different errors still left in the book, even though I read this book a zillion times and there's more errors. It's like, there's more, and it's like, oh my gosh, how did I miss all this stuff? Or even like really obvious stuff. So yeah, that's my experience.
I can guarantee you that every writer who has attended this panel is sitting here nodding, going, yes, sounds very familiar. Susan, what other questions do we have?
Hope Tar has a question. She's curious that in your respective research for your books, Nicole and Piper, what was the most surprising historical finding that you unearthed?
I guess for me, I found I found some primary sources from the time period. It was a pocket diary from Emily Davis, who was a dressmaker during Philadelphia during Civil War. And so it was a lot of her day-to-day stuff in the book. I mean, it had, you know, her talking about the weather, being sick, visiting friends, and some notes about her family and friends and like that. But she also had a few spots where she kind of had her thoughts about the ending Civil War, or when Lincoln died and he was in Philadelphia and all this other stuff. It was very fascinating to kind of see that, a regular person's life at that time period. And it was the thing I just found by accident. It was so like helpful to me, just getting a feel of what these characters would have their day-to-day lives. So that was like my favorite little piece of research I found.
Yeah, I would just point to experiences of the ancestors that would really illustrate the strength and resilience that they had. One of them that really hit me was the one about a mother and a daughter who had one dress between the two of them. And this was just in the wake after the Civil War, when several teachers came south to teach the recently enslaved how to read and write. So they had one dress, and the daughter would wear the dress and go to school during the day. And she'd come back and the mother would put the dress on and go at night. Yeah, and it just really, that always just makes me think, wow, you know, what perseverance to get an education.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. I think I just saw another question from Jerry. Hi, Susan, I think there's another question from Jerry.
Yeah, Jerry says how far we are willing to bend historical truth to make the story better. And Carrie Hayes said we could use a story about a Marvel Jackson Cook. Here's another question we have for Piper. Piper, you mentioned your aunts. Did you use your family's history in your books? And if you did, do they recognize themselves in it?
Well, they're deceased, so, and my family doesn't read my books, so I can use whatever I want.
Here's another question then for you, Piper. Have you been to the town that your family is named after?
The what? Say it again, Susan.
Yes. Have you been to the town that your family is named after?
Yeah, I've driven through it. It's like 3 stoplights. It's not, you know. 85, probably like research trips I was making to Tuskegee from Atlanta to Tuskegee. I'd make a little, whip around, come out the other side and get back on the highway. It's really something.
Nicole, here's a question for you. Your book has history, fantasy, and mystery. Did you have that mix in mind when you set out to write The Conductors?
No, not exactly. The Conductors was originally a short story, and it was a straight historical fiction. And like I said earlier, it was one of the stories I had on the back burner for a while. It was like, I had an idea for characters, I had an idea for the premise, but it wasn't going anywhere until I added fantasy into it. For some reason, it's like, yeah, I have a story now. And the mystery element, just like I said, it just fell into place as I kind of explored, did some research, and just got a better feel of the characters. So.
And here's another question for you, Nicole. First, how long did it take you to write The Conductors, and was the release of your book delayed because of COVID?
Yeah. For writing the book, my first draft. I usually do a first draft pretty quickly, so I think it was about 2 months. But I revised over like several years, even before I got an agent, got the deal, and everything like that. So I always feel like that's the bigger part. Like I can't forget exactly how long I could say I was writing it, but it was several years worth of writing to get it to the final state. And yes, it did get delayed because of the virus and everything. Like, they got pushed back. It was originally supposed to be November of last year, so it got delayed.
Bummer.
Not too bad. I mean, it was an interesting day in November. That was supposed to be. So I'm kind of happy. I wasn't too upset when he said let's do March instead.
Yeah.
And same question for you, Piper. Did you find that your books, in terms of being in the pipeline, have they been delayed because of COVID too?
Not so far, no. So that's been a blessing. It's out long enough, I guess, in terms of winter 2022 that it's like, nope.
Oh, Piper, here's a
Very
question.
interesting. I want to know I'm sorry, Susan, go ahead.
There was just another question for you, Piper.
Okay.
You teach writing and you write. Do you have your students read your works, or do you keep that separate?
It's separate. That's a little bit of a, that's not right to ask the students to spend money on my books, even though where I teach, the books are in the library. So you can't take them out if they want to, physical books. But yeah, the purpose in writing them, for me, it always been for them to read something else besides Zane, people who have seen it. I talked to my literature students, and she's a very nice lady, and I've met her on several occasions, but there are some other things you can read. And maybe this might be something you could read and find out more about your ancestors and stuff. I happened to notice, Susan, in the chat, just looking out of the corner of my eye, I think it was Cynthia who said some of the topics about Black women biopics. The Dorothy Dandridge story starring Halle Berry is more than 20 years old now, and it was on HBO. It is not a feature film. So the question that I'd ask my students is bent and predicated upon a feature film. People who are going to, in that pre-COVID kind of way, to spend money to sit in a movie theater, because that's where all the budgeting and all the money goes to. We really don't want to talk about Nina as a film. I had my students watch it as part of class, and they were appalled. I didn't do anything in terms of how they should feel about that particular movie, but we can do that better. And, Bessie Smith, the Bessie Smith by Queen Latifah, which is wonderful, was also HBO. So if you come up with other ones, but when I say that you cannot count on two hands the number of biopics, feature film biopics featuring Black women. You can't.
Yeah. I think there was another
Yeah,
question
I was
for
gonna say,
Piper,
you
just
make me think.
asking whether or not your students find your books anyway.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. But young people these days need to do more reading. So
Yes,
it's
yes,
perfect.
absolutely.
They're not doing the reading I assigned, let alone. Okay, so some of them do. I'm not trying to say all of them don't, but I try to assign things that are interesting, and keep them engaged. But they need to read, so it's fine. Read whatever, just do it. It's my perspective, anyway. And I'll make note of Marvel Jackson Cook. She's someone I didn't know about, so I will make note of her in terms of that. I also saw, I think, was it Susan, you were about to ask about what Jerry said? How far are we willing to bend historical truth to make the story better?
Yes, that was the question, yes.
Whose history is always my question. And one of the things that I like to emphasize to whenever I speak or to my students, tales of hunting always glorify the hunter. And so the lion has its own historian. This is an old African proverb of wisdom. Lion's not gotten to tell the story. That's my whole point in terms of thinking about these Black women and having a voice. It's not got a chance to tell the story. It is a different perspective. And I would argue and say the history is incomplete. This is the thing with it. So when we talk about historical accuracy or historical truth, my question is, whose accuracy and whose truth are you referring to? So history is comprised of many, many, many perspectives, and we're missing out. And it's time that these perspectives be restored, in my point of view.
That is actually a beautiful segue into the next series of questions that I have. So touching on that, what do you both feel when you're approaching your writing? What do you feel is your greatest responsibility as an author in telling these stories?
I think for me, particularly since I am writing with some fantasy elements, some genre elements to it, is to delineate what's historical facts and what's just me messing around, adding things on top. And that was one thing that I was careful about. Especially when I reference certain events or certain people, I want to make it clear these are kind of real, or make it seem like it's separate for real. Then also make it really obvious things aren't exaggerating, especially when usually when there's magic in the mix. This is me making things up, and I'm just finding balance, being as accurate as possible, and I don't know, I think those were the top concerns, the things I always came with each time I draft and each time I revise, is making sure. And just kind of staying true with the characters, through the people I found interest in the research, and not attributing things that in the wrong fashion.
Very good, very good. What about you, Piper? What do you think is your greatest responsibility as an author?
To be true as I possibly can to representing these women who have not been represented heretofore. So that to me is utmost. And as I said, I guess I'll talk about whenever I have my panel at the Historical Novelist Society, along with my co-presenters, Vanessa Riley and Denny Bryce, to write biographical fiction for a Black protagonist is different, because these same things in terms of primary and secondary and all of that kind of stuff, resources, don't exist in the same way for these people. So then what do you do? How do you then maintain a sense of the story ringing true and being true without those materials? And that's what we're going to talk about I think it's the Thursday of that conference. So, yeah.
Very good. That's I do want to just mention here that the H&S Society meetings, the conferences, are more than just for writers. I know several readers who have gone to those conferences as well. So I would say if you are not a writer, but rather a reader of historical fiction who has joined us, you may find some value in taking a look at the program this year, a virtual program, and seeing whether or not you might find some sessions that may appeal to you as well. If nothing else, it will be a wonderful opportunity for you to see some of your favorite authors speaking at the conference, but also you may gain value from attending even as a reader yourself, so do consider it. I'm glad you brought up the concept of resources, Piper, because that's something that I often find it depends on what exactly you're writing, that you're able to touch on certain resources, and others are completely inaccessible behind university library firewalls and whatever have you. When you both were going about your research for these novels, how would you break that down? Were you finding you were going mainly to online sources? Were you going to other areas like either reenactment societies or things that authors wouldn't necessarily think of doing research on, but as a way for you to find the resources that have either been pretty much hidden, destroyed, or are no longer existent? How did you both approach that process of research?
I think even in terms of talking about like certain primary things that have not even existed because people are too busy living to be writing stuff down. So that's one of the things to keep in mind when looking at such a thing as a secondary source. You know, what is the same things that I teach my students? What's the agenda? Who's writing it? What are they trying to present? Is there some way we can get behind all of that and tease out what she might have been thinking or feeling in terms of giving that particular interview? What face was she trying to present? What facade was she trying to put out there? How was she selling herself? And I'm thinking most particularly because of Anne Lowe in terms of these things. But I've also traveled, you know, in terms of looking at where characters have lived, or you know, the landscape of their lives and all of that other kind of stuff. So that's also to me important research is able to be done. You know, I'm willing to get in the car and do it.
Excellent, excellent. What about you, Nicole? Since I believe Portia Williams from Real Housewives of Atlanta let us know that she found out that there's actually not a physical underground railroad. How did you approach the writing for your story?
Yeah, it's with anything. I always go big and wide when I start researching any kind of topic. I know I actually went further back in time in the early like 1800s to kind of get a broad scape of foundation, figure out what's going on. Then I narrowed it down to particularly Philadelphia in 1870s, particularly 1871, and kind of narrowed down like what's going on, like what kind of I looked up biographies of prominent people at that time. I think I'd try to find like some interesting primary sources. I think I looked up newspapers that were going on at that time to get an idea of like the articles of the day, sort of thing, even though it's like get a kind of taste of like what's going on at a particular time, and just not to narrow this stuff down. I know it's got a lot of books out in the library, a lot of some of the cross reference mostly to see if to make sure more than like two books are saying the same thing, because I found sometimes I would find something that's really interesting, but it's only that one book or this one author saying it. So I was like doing a lot of cross-checking with certain things and just verifying all these like myths, like figuring out like, you know, just figure out like what really made up the Underground Railroad, for example, like how extensive, how was it? And like you even found like wasn't as active as I thought it was. I think one of the funny things I found was that it more or less wasn't as active like once I guess the Anti-Emancipation Proclamation came out. It's like activity wasn't as heightened as it was before then. But for my book, it was like, since I was like, I wanted my character more involved, so I kind of tweaked that a bit, this because I'm leaning into the fantasy element things. I had to figure out the divide of like what kind of resources, where's like the history start, and where I can start tweaking little things here and there, and try and figure out the extent of like what the extent I can start tweaking things. I don't think I really tweaked stuff that was like more superficial, like certain things that would serve the characters, but just for research wise, it's more of this like a lot of cross-checking, a lot of diving different things. I fortunately didn't get a chance to travel. That was one of the things I didn't have enough time with, and later kind of wasn't able to do it at all in general. But there's a lot of it's looking at a lot. I think I dug up some old maps. I did a lot of time looking for really old maps of Philadelphia, just finding I found stuff that's before, a little bit before my time period, a little before after, and kind of cross comparing it with the modern map to get a sense of like where things are, in which it was kind of fascinating to see how the little changes are, and just like kind of digging into like archives like that. I did a lot of my fun part. The fun of this research was looking at all the pictures of that time period. I think I did a search of all like 19th century photographs, and it's lots of little rabbit holes of all the pictures out there, just get a sense of the clothing, what the things people looks like. It gives a more visual way you don't really get from books. That was probably the funnest part, is just this rabbit hole looking up pictures and for all this other stuff. And and also just kind of going rabbit holes as anything that's interesting to me, and it's kind of going down of all these whether it's like scientific stuff, artist stuff, just rabbit holes everywhere.
I just want to say one more thing that I think ties into Roger's earlier comment. I'm always looking, I always have my antenna up. I'm always looking. And one of my favorite things, especially because I do a certain amount of 20th century research, and that as of late, especially I think within like the past 6 months, I don't know what stirred them to open the vaults or whatever, is C-SPAN 3. With C-SPAN 3 every weekend features historical programming, and they have a program called Real America, REEL America, where they bring out all of those old historical that we see as historical films that were intended to educate children. I sort of have a fond memory. I'm older than Nicole. She probably doesn't have this memory the same as I do. But, when they would bring out the projector, and everybody would be like, yay, and there's this educational film time that they've been showing those, a certain selection of those. And it really does give a perspective in terms of, and they do show the viewpoints of Black life from the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s. So my spaceship question, which Roger was asking about it by his comment, is pointed directly to the United States. Mm-hmm. So that is where my area of expertise is. And one of the things that backs up the spaceship is a little film that they showed a couple of months ago that was produced by the government on behalf of NATO. And they did these about 20-minute films about the countries that belonged to NATO. And I had watched the film that they did about the United States. And in that film, over that 20 minutes, someone like me, intersectional Black woman, does not appear.
Wow.
I'm not in that film. No one who looks like me is in that film. So I think it was produced in 54, 55, or 56. So when was when Rosa Parks, right? I didn't exist. And I know full well that there were Black women in those years because I came from them, right?
Right.
That's what I mean. That's what the spaceship question means. I have the link. I'll put it in the chat if anybody wants to watch the little film to see what I mean. I kept waiting and waiting. Surely, if they're going to talk about the United States, there's the history of it. Surely we're going to show up as one man real quick. Don't blink. You'll miss them. But Black women don't appear. So that's part of why I do what I do.
Thank you so much for that link, Piper.
Sure.
That is absolutely important. And as you say, representation matters, not just for us as Black people, for women in general. Representation matters. So that's interesting that you mentioned that. So it's often said that for writers, if there's a book out there that you want to write that you're not seeing, well, obviously you should be the person that is writing it. What's next for both of you? What will each of you be working on for the future?
Okay, Nicole.
Next with me is literally the next book after The Conductors. I recently just turned that in, so I'm getting ready to